Welcome to our viewers. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are located at the University of Maryland, College Park. Today's program, I'm pleased to announce, is co-sponsored or sponsored by many sponsors, including the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology, as well as, and I'm very excited about this, the Phillips Collection, which is America's first home for the modern and contemporary arts, and it's located in Washington, D.C. My gratitude goes out to Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair, for organizing, doing all the background work for today's event. Of course, I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our speaker today that I will introduce in a minute, Ms. Kirsten Mullen. We welcome you. But first, I must go over some technical stuff. Upon joining this virtual meeting, you are muted and your video is turned off. This program is being recorded. By participating in this virtual meeting, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, and voice possibly being recorded. You will have the opportunity to submit questions using the Q&A function at the end of the lecture. The Q&A function is at the bottom of your screen, and this will happen at the end of the lecture when we open up the session to your questions. So about today's program. The Bahá'í Chair for World Peace has been actively involved in addressing topics that are central to the pursuit of peace. We view peace as an all-embracing, holistic process focused on human rights and well-being for all people. In fact, it includes humanity as a whole. Our program focuses on 5 central themes that are regarded as barriers to peace. One of these themes is structural racism and the root causes of prejudice, which today's program focuses on. Today's presentation examines monuments and memory, or what is to be done with the some 2,000 Confederate monuments and memorials that are still on display throughout the United States. Monuments represent a kind of secular shared faith in that our most permanent structures, or at least semi-permanent ones, may grant us a chance to consider large ideas, to be inspired by ideals, and to self-identify with what really matters to us as people and why. What we build reveals what we believe mattered before, what matters to us now, and what we believe will last into the future. The fall of monuments causes us to revisit controversies long unsettled and to qualify our civic instincts, collective choices, and public desires. The construction or deconstruction of certain cherished ideals grants us a window into considering and re-examining the physical past so that we might make better, bolder decisions about our present and about our future. Our distinguished speaker today explores the important topic of Confederate monuments and memorials. Ms. Kirsten Mullen is a folklorist and the founder of Artfactual, an arts consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the Freelon Ajay Bond Concept development team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution's Commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Under the auspices of the North Carolina Arts Council, She worked to expand the Coastal Folklife Survey. As a faculty member with the Community Folklife Documentation Institute, she trained students to research and document the state's African American music heritage. Ms. Mullen was a consultant on the North Carolina Museum of History's exhibition projects, two of them, one called the North Carolina Legends and the other Civil Rights. Her writings can be found in museum catalogs and journals and in commercial media, and includes Black Culture and History Matter, which examines the politics of funding Black cultural institutions. She is co-author with Dr. William Doherty in a book that they just recently published, a very important book called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. It is with great pleasure that I introduce not only Ms. Mullen, but the title of her talk, Reading Monuments, Making Turf, and Embedding Memories. Welcome, Ms. Mullen.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahmoud. It is a pleasure to be with you. And I want to thank also Professor Seaman for tremendous assistance and just the invitation to be with you today. All right, I'm going to just jump right in and share my screen. So I believe you'll be able to see this. All right. So this presentation will focus on monuments and memory, as Professor Mahmoud said, but who and what is deemed worthy enough to be written into American history, and who we will carry into what Erica Doss has called our imagined national future. So I am interested in understanding what America's monuments represent. That is, what is the work they are performing, and the battles over what is to be done with these 2,000 plus Confederate monuments and memorials still on display in the United States, in and on the grounds of city halls, county courthouses, municipal buildings and parks, including, a rough estimate, some 710 plantations, national memorials, national landmarks, National Register of Historic Places properties, 19 in North Carolina alone, 6 of which have been deemed, quote, state historic sites that are open to the public. So we begin with Rosenwald Schools. The second battle is the fight to preserve Black American history. But this has garnered far less attention than these Confederate monuments. Until recently, structures like this Rosenwald School were deemed unimportant and allowed to fall apart and disappear. These were the schools built across the South for Black children through a partnership between Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee Institute and philanthropist Julius Rosenwald. Now on the 11 most endangered historic places list, only 10 to 12% of the 5,357 schools, shops, and teacher homes constructed between 1917 and 1932 are estimated to survive today. This is a slide of the African burial ground in New York City. Some of you may recall there was a major construction project at the base of Wall Street in New York City. And when the engineers and contractors were digging, excavating, to be able to install, the superstructures that would hold up this edifice, they discovered, skulls and bones, and it's like, oh my gosh, what happened? What is this? What have we come to here? And what they discovered was an African burial ground. It was actually on the maps, the early maps of the city, but those maps had not been consulted. And so, here was a whole new history of New York that was being, rediscovered for many people. But tens of thousands of Black people, were murdered in white massacres. This was not the case necessarily with the African burial ground, but I'm talking about the white massacres that occurred between Reconstruction and World War I. Their bodies were thrown into rivers or piled up in wooded areas near where they were killed, unremarked and unmarked. Who are the children, the mothers and fathers interred in the Negro burial grounds in your hometown? Alice Walker found the burial ground of folklorist Zora Neale Hurston in Florida, in Eatonville. Her final resting place was discovered. But where was Richmond, Virginia's Black insurrectionist Gabriel, known as Gabriel Prosser to some? Where was he buried? Or North Carolina's Black freedom fighter and Union Army spy, Abraham Galloway? So this is the house that Malcolm X lived in with his sister, Ella Little Collins, in Roxbury, Massachusetts, beginning in 1941. It has now been listed as a historic site. Collins has plans to renovate the structure for graduate students studying African-American history, social justice, or civil rights. This is the home of Paulie Murray. Several new books have been written in recent years describing the life and achievements of this queer civil rights lawyer who has been canonized a saint. Paulie Murray's family home, which was built by her grandparents, the Richard Fitzgeralds in Durham, North Carolina in 1898. That's the same year of the Wilmington, North Carolina White Riot that ended Black co-governance in that city and decimated the Black population, but this structure has been restored. So this rescue work, it's a term coined by poet and Mellon Foundation president Elizabeth Alexander, is being done by a host of lay and professional practitioners, including Brett Leggs, who is the director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So who is this gentleman? This is Emery Mwazulu Diabanza. So this is another battlefront, for us to contemplate. So Emery Mwazulu Diabanza is a Congolese Pan-African political activist, and he is involved in retrieving sacred objects that colonizers have stolen from their subjects, over the centuries. So he is best known, for his support of cultural restitution and the removal of African artifacts from European museums. Let's see. So here he is, grabbing a wooden. He was caught on the security camera video, but here he is grabbing a wooden funerary post that was created by artisans in Chad during the 19th century from the Quai Branly Museum in Paris in June 2020. So I remember well the hostile stares I got at my first National Trust conference in San Antonio, Texas, 40 years ago, when I asked why America's plantations were not classified as Black historic landmarks. Several white participants expressed the belief that no structures in the United States connected to Black people were worthy of preservation. A private individual spent 16 years and $8 million restoring Louisiana's Whitney Plantation, which was founded in 1752, as a site honoring the memory of the Black people who had been enslaved at the site. So contrast that, to the project at the Middleton Place Plantation near Charleston, South Carolina, which still defines itself on its website solely as the primary residence of several generations of the Middleton family, many of whom played prominent roles in the colonial and antebellum history of South Carolina. There's no mention of the 800 enslaved Black people who built and sustained all of the Middleton family's enterprises. Toy Derricott, the co-founder of Kavi Kanum, which is a nonprofit, but importantly, a home and a gathering place for Black poets, recalled a similar encounter with a dismissive gatekeeper. Toy writes, when I was in graduate school in 1985, and I asked why we had never read an African-American poet, my graduate professor said, quote, "We don't go down that low," end quote. So we weren't reading any African-American writers. And if you were an African-American poet, there was just no way you could have some validation, she wrote. So I started my professional life in Texas's State Historic Preservation Office. And the first article I ever published, a survey of America's Black Historic Preservation Movement, was commissioned by Michael Ainsley, who was then president and CEO of the National Trust. I would like nothing more than to dive deeper into this part of the movement struggle, but I'm going to push ahead and focus on the Confederacy because the Confederacy's work continues to affect us all. All right. We can think of these structures, these statues, as billboards or social media of their day. Constant, protean, bigger than life, eye-catching reminders situated on prime real estate. Public landscapes where neither they nor their meaning could be missed. Their very presence and grandeur screamed normalcy, acceptance, authority, and importantly, this object is sanctioned by officialdom. Like the ad banners on your favorite internet platform, they catch your eye and occasionally divert your attention long enough for one, and by one I mean an acolyte, long enough to stop and read a bit of text and share a selfie and send it to your friends. They were and are reminders of an era when life's hierarchies and rankings were more orderly and predictable, when white meant right and white supremacists could openly exert their will over Black people and their supporters. Here we see the likeness of Confederate General Alfred Mouton after it's been taken down from its perch in City Hall in Lafayette, Louisiana. He and the 18th Louisiana, which he commanded, were defeated by Union generals Tecumseh Sherman and John A. McClernand at the Battle of Shiloh in Corinth, Mississippi. But he rallied to secure the Bayou Teche area of Louisiana for the traitorous rebels. Catherine Beischer, who is curator of architectural records, special collections at the North Carolina State University Libraries, has made the following keen observation on the deliberate and calculated nature of lost cause memorization. I quote, "By putting in permanent public form a single version of the past, the creators of these monuments laid lasting claim to their definition of the past and set the terms by which they meant to shape the future," end quote. So the rebels sought with great success to ensure that the memory of the Confederacy and its leadership was an object of veneration instead of an object of shame. So many of those turf marking statues were commissioned by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the 126-year-old organization that is dedicated to keeping alive the lost cause narrative for Americans. I wanted to get an idea about what precisely groups like the UDC, who are responsible for the existence of so many of these structures, say about the meaning of these monuments. So what do they say the monuments mean? Now, this is the full view of this monument that's behind the monument at the top, this Confederate monument in Arlington, Virginia, at the National Cemetery. Excuse me. According to the UDC's website, members are, quote, dedicated to the purpose of honoring the memory of its Confederate ancestors, protecting, preserving, and marking the places made historic by Confederate valor, collecting and preserving the material for a truthful history of the war between the states, recording the participation of Southern women in their patient endurance of hardship and patriotic devotion during and after the war between the states. There is more, but this is what I want us to think about today. Okay. So here is the UDC's code. So, I learned that the UDC has been in a protracted dispute with the Encyclopedia of Virginia, among others, about the negative characterization of their organization's activities that are being portrayed currently. After being bombarded with letters from individual UDC members, Encyclopedia of Virginia decided to respond on its webpage to the perceived, quote, factual inaccuracies cited by the UDC. Arthur Brendan Wolfe saying, while Encyclopedia of Virginia is delighted when readers point out errors, quote, what we have with the United Daughters of the Confederacy is different, he says. While they argue that we are being factually inaccurate, they are not actually able to identify any factual inaccuracies. Instead, their objections are philosophical. At the crux of this philosophical disagreement, Wolfe continues, is the phrase white supremacy. The UDC members object to any association of these words with their organization, past or present. To them, it puts the UDC in league with the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis, and sometimes it did, he writes. But what the entry argues is that the traditional efforts of the UDC, raising funds for Confederate monuments, sponsoring Memorial Day parades, caring for indigent Confederate widows, sponsoring essay contests and fellowships for white Southern students, and maintaining Confederate museums and relic collections. All of this has been undertaken in the context of the lost cause interpretation of the Civil War. So what do we mean by the lost cause? So Brendan Wolfe writes, long the prevailing ideology of not only the UDC, but of the United Confederate Veterans, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and much of the post-war elite white culture, it follows several basic precepts. The Confederacy didn't start the war. Slavery had nothing to do with it. Enslaved people were generally well treated and faithful to their masters. The United States only won because of its industry and manpower and a willingness to sacrifice the lives of its soldiers. And Confederate soldiers were uniquely heroic and Confederate women uniquely honorable. So what does this have to do with white supremacy? Asked the Encyclopedia Virginia staff. All of these things add up to a nostalgic elevation of a society, the foundation of which was the violent enslavement of other human beings. And this elevation was not by accident. It came at precisely the moment when those formerly enslaved people were competing with their former enslavers for political power. But asserting that slavery was not this bad and that white people had always acted honorably and in the best interests of Blacks, the lost cause became an argument for a society in which white people belonged at the top of the order and Blacks at the bottom. That's white supremacy, Wolfe concludes. Not coincidentally, I've been wondering if, I've long been wondering if the United Daughters of the Confederacy openly commemorated the Ku Klux Klan. It turns out I'm not the only person who's wanted to know if evidence of a direct connection exists. Greg Huffman, while researching an article on the UDC for Facing South, A Voice for a Changing South, discovered a weathered 1941 first edition of North Carolina's Confederate Monuments and Memorials, penned by Mrs. S.L. Smith. It's one of the few compilations by the UDC itself. Smith was a historian of the North Carolina Division, the State Archive, and the repository owned a copy. So on page 35, Huffman writes, was the answer to his and my question, did the UDC, a group responsible for most of the Confederate monuments roiling communities today, and that still promotes itself as, quote, historical, educational, benevolent, memorial, and patriotic, did it erect a monument to white supremacist terrorist groups? And the answer is a resounding yes. This is the banner that they designed to accompany the monument to the Klan. And this was in Cabarrus County, North Carolina. So the General P.G.T. Beauregard Equestrian Statue in New Orleans, this is one that has been removed. Larger than life, the statue is 27 feet in height. The horse and the rider are 16 feet. It was unveiled in 1919 in City Park in New Orleans. And some of you may be aware that all of the most prominent Civil War Confederates monuments have been removed in New Orleans. When the monument was dismantled, they discovered a time capsule inside the base. The capsule was opened on August 3rd, 2018, and found to contain Confederate memorabilia, including photos of Confederate General Robert E. Lee and Confederate President Jefferson Davis, along with flags, currency, medals, ribbons, and other ephemera, paper items mostly related to the city. I was curious to see how the staff of the National Trust for Historic Preservation had couched the justification for the sculpture when they submitted it for consideration for inclusion on the nation's prized architecture list. Note the absence of the actual cause of the Civil War in this text, which was crafted in 1999. The cult of the lost cause has its roots in the Southern search for justification and the need to find a substitute for victory in the Civil War. In attempting to deal with defeat, Southerners created an image of the war as a great heroic epic. A major theme in the cult of the lost cause was the clash of two civilizations, one inferior to the other. The North, invigorated by constant struggle with nature, had become materialistic, grasping for wealth and power. The South had a more generous climate, which had led to a finer society based upon veracity and honor in man, chastity and fidelity in women. Like tragic heroes, Southerners had waged a noble but doomed struggle to preserve their superior civilization. There was an element of chivalry in the way the South had fought, achieving noteworthy victories against staggering odds. This was the lost cause as the late 19th century saw it, and a whole generation of Southerners set about glorifying and celebrating it. No mention of slavery. So, old school markers, I call these, history sound bites. State history markers, visual history sound bites are another arena where turf battles and their meaning are fighting for your attention. A decade ago, I saw these battles solely as distractions from the main work of enacting a national reparations program for Black American descendants of US slavery. I now see them as having at least two purposes: alerting the public to our received history, that is the one dictated by organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Ku Klux Klan, and inscribed in textbooks that educated 3 generations of children, myself included, and normalizing it for all of us in what Brent Staples derisively called innocuous symbols of Southern pride. And about these instruments of, and so the second piece then is that they serve as lightning rods for the need for a nation, for our nation to dig into its history and educate itself about these instruments of racial terror that punctuate our actual history. So here's a visual illustration of how the trends are moving. This earlier state marker, which is these are the ones that are mostly in evidence today, from 1992. Very short, very cryptic. You don't even know that John Coltrane was Black, when you look at this marker. But the second one, and I would encourage you to go to North Carolina State Archives website and look up state markers and read in detail the text here. But the idea is, more information. We're trying to, convince people that it's worthwhile. Your efforts will be rewarded if you go and do a deep dive. Do your own research. Look up what the state has written. So all of these markers have behind them a bibliography. They also have a much more extended write-up about the subjects and subject matter. So research is a good thing. All right. Oops, sorry. So I want to talk a little bit too about D.H. Hill, who we will hear about. So you'll see, I'm going to jump up to a marker of Hill. Nope, not there. D.H. Hill, a Confederate officer, was devoted to the white supremacist lost cause interpretation of Southern history. Hill lived in Charlotte, North Carolina after the war and was married to Stonewall Jackson's sister. And he would become president of both the University of Arkansas and the State Agricultural College in Milledgeville, Georgia. He had tremendous influence in the academic space. Before he was appointed to these positions, however, Hill published a magazine and a weekly periodical established in 1870. So Hill's editorial statement left no doubt as to the thrust of his paper. He writes, "We are devoted to the vindication of the truth of Southern history, to the preservation of Southern characteristics, to the development of Southern resources under the changed relation of the labor system." I love that, just the changed relation, and the advancement of Southern interests. So the devotion was to the white supremacist lost cause interpretation of Southern history. So when William Darity and I began this work 30 years ago for him and 15 for me, we imagined colleges and universities would lead the charge, for reparations for Black people in this country. After the 2013 publication of Craig Stephen Wilder's critically acclaimed Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's University, a mass of institutions admitted their complicity with slavery. Administrators of America's aspiring elite schools had worked tirelessly to convince planters, to break with tradition and send their sons to homegrown universities instead of their European antecedents, especially Cambridge and Oxford. So today, universities in both the UK and the USA are being challenged to reckon with the repressed memories of their myriad benefits from the slave trade and slavery. Their responses have varied widely in substance, contriteness, and magnanimity. While we do not hold these academic institutions responsible for paying the reparations bill, that does not mean that they should be let off the hook. In fact, we encourage them to make all possible good faith initiatives to address both past and present racial wrongs of their institutions. These institutions can become passionate and full-throated advocates for reparations for living descendants of slavery from their national governments. They can use their resources to lobby, to cajole, and petition Congress and Parliament, respectively, to enact comprehensive plans for reparations. Universities can become active agents for authentic racial justice. Okay. Less well publicized are the efforts of the deconfederatizers. So deconfederation, this is a term that I coined to describe the process that did not happen after the Civil War. And the deconfederatizers, these are the US equivalents of the folks involved in denazification. Had we had such a process, the events of January 6, 2021 may not have happened. Deja vu. There are dozens of active deconfederatizers, but their actions, like working with individual states to eliminate the ubiquitous state markers that celebrate the achievements of the secessionists and more contemporary white supremacists, are not getting a great deal of attention. So I'm going to bring your attention to a group called We Need More History. These are scholars and curious observers alike who are calling for more history. They want to shed light on what Jennifer Schlusser calls the distortions, the omissions, and the erasure of Black contributions. So who were the more than 180,000 Black Union military personnel who fought and died alongside their white comrades in the Civil War? It might be helpful here to review the situation on the ground in the American South immediately after the Civil War ended. Thaddeus Stevens. Right. Unlike today, the radicals in President Abraham Lincoln's party had no compunction about labeling the rebels as traitors. The radical Republicans were seeking a comprehensive deconfederation of the American South. Abolish, yes, abolish everything on the face of the earth but this union. Stevens said, free every slave, slay every traitor, burn every rebel mansion. If these things be necessary to preserve this temple of freedom to the world and to our prosperity. This was the rallying cry Thaddeus Stevens, the conscience of the radicals, raised during the speech he gave when he won renomination for his congressional seat in 1862. Stevens was joined by fellow radical Republicans, Senator Benjamin Wade, a Republican from Ohio, but also Aaron Harris, a Republican from New York, and Representative Henry Winter Davis, a Republican from Maryland, in the drive to impose tougher eligibility requirements on the former Confederate states before they could be readmitted to the Union. The Wade-Davis bill would have accomplished that goal and potentially eliminated the possibility that members of Confederate officialdom could assume political office during the post-war period. In the radical Republicans' view, lifetime exclusion from the political process and a purging of the government, a process known as lustration, was a logical step to take after the, quote, greatest difficulty the country had ever experienced or was likely to experience, end quote. Given the horrendous crimes and injustices that had been committed by the secessionists, the bill's supporters reasoned only drastic steps could reestablish the country's moral order and restore peace. The Wade-Davis bill passed both the Senate and the House, only to be, quote, pocket vetoed by Lincoln. Although Lincoln affirmed Wade-Davis as, quote, one very proper plan for the loyal people of any state choosing to adopt it, Lincoln did not sign the bill, thereby killing it, and counseled tolerance and cooperation instead. The president continued to press his offer of compensated emancipation, paying the enslavers outright for their black chattel in exchange for them freeing them. But even as the outcome of the war was becoming increasingly clear in the Union's favor, Lincoln still offered them money for their enslaved property. In February 1865, when the war approached its fourth full year, Lincoln and Secretary of State William Henry Seward met with Confederate Vice President Alexander Hamilton Stevens in an attempt to come to an agreement on Confederate surrender. William Darity and I discussed this meeting in Chapter 5 of our book, From Here to Equality. Lincoln's offer to minimize additional loss of life by compensating the slave owners for removing the shackles from their human captives if they would agree to an armistice was rejected. 2 months after Stevens met with Lincoln at the peace conference, Lee relinquished his command and surrendered, and the war finally ended. But the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, never surrendered. As George Fletcher has quoted, Davis was so, as Fletcher has noted, Davis was so devoted to the cause that even after Lee's surrender on April 9th, 1865, Davis remained defiant. He took his rump government into hiding in the Deep South and was not captured until May 11th, end quote. The Southern racial terrain far too closely resembled its characteristics before the war. The failure of emancipation to produce Black citizenship was not solely a matter of what was not done for Blacks. It was also a matter of what was not done to the rebels. We are left only to speculate at what might have been if there had been a thoroughgoing deconfederation of the American South. Lincoln's amnesty plan was designed to reestablish the brotherhood of the divided Union and to hasten the war's end. Johnson initially, this is Andrew Johnson, who was his successor, Andrew Johnson initially insisted that harsh punishment should be meted out to the ex-Confederate leaders. As vice president, Andrew Johnson had espoused anti-slavery views. Less well known, however, was his harshly anti-Black viewpoint. Johnson's complete disdain for Black Americans would shape his approach to Reconstruction. Vice President Johnson had entreated Lincoln to punish the rebels. In a speech given after the fall of Richmond, which signaled the end of the war, he sounded like a radical Republican when he said, quote, "I would arrest the high-ranking Confederates. I would try them. I would convict them. Johnson seemed to recognize fleetingly the need for what we call deconfederation. Quote, "Death is too easily a punishment," he said. "Treason must be made odious, and traitors must be punished and impoverished, their social power broken. They must be made to feel the penalty of their crimes," he said. But within 1 month of his swearing-in ceremony, then President Johnson, largely acting independently of Congress, implemented a fundamentally divergent Reconstruction plan calling for the elimination of the loyalty oath quota and weakening the state's obligations to protect the new liberated status of ex-slaves. In an affront to the radical Republicans, Johnson announced his intention to restore all but the highest civil and diplomatic officers of the Confederacy to the Union. He also asserted explicitly that states' rights trumped congressional authority. Does that sound familiar? Thereby entrusting the question of Black suffrage to the individual states and to the executive office. Again, very familiar. And it affirmed, and he also affirmed that white supremacy must be upheld. "This is a country for white men," Johnson wrote to Governor Thomas C. Fletcher of Missouri, "and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." Reports detailing the extensive abuses Blacks were suffering at the hands of ex-Confederates arrived at the White House by the mail coach load. From the convention halls of Louisiana came complaints from free men of color who previously had enjoyed privileges unheard of in other parts of the South, that members of the planter class and affluent merchants were determined to hold exclusive power and refused to co-govern with Blacks. 11 men from Alabama who described victims of contract fraud and the absence of due process in the courts concluded emphatically, "This is not the pursuit of happiness," end quote. Andrew Johnson's own emissary, General Carl Schurz, the influential German-American immigrant leader and journalist, brought back overwhelming evidence of widespread violence against Blacks, the lack of accountability in local justice systems, and Blacks' impoverished living conditions. These people were remaining defiant. When Whitelaw Reid, excuse me, in Thaddeus Stevenson's view, only a radical reorganization of Southern institutions, habits, and manners would bring about the transformation he and others had been advocating over the course of the previous 20 years. Immediately after the surrender, when the ex-Confederates had been brought down by their defeat, there was a propitious moment. From fall 1865 to early 1866, many Americans, Black and white, Northern and Southern, expected significant penalties to be imposed on the states formerly in rebellion as a condition for their readmission to the Union. When Whitelaw Reid traveled along the Atlantic coast and spoke with a cross-section of residents, including shopkeepers, Black artisans, farmers, and planters, but also Freedmen's Bureau agents and officers and freedmen themselves in urban and rural areas, and toured several cotton plantations, he observed, quote, "It was manifest that if restoration of civil authority depended on Negro suffrage, it would be accepted." Scherz's report to Johnson concluded, "When the news of Lee's and Joseph Johnston's surrenders burst upon the South, the general consternation was extreme. The public mind was so despondent that if readmission at some future time under whatever conditions had been promised, it would have been looked upon as a favor," end quote. Here was the ideal moment to push forward for the full array of Black rights. But when Johnson opened the door for North Carolina to reorganize its state government without making provisions for Blacks' political rights, and followed that with pardons and paroles for, quote, "prominent, wealthy insurgents," Ex-Confederate leaders, generals, and diplomats, Southerners understood the president was willing to concede to them more power than they had dared hope. Almost immediately after Johnson's proclamation was announced, white Southerners' resistance to Black voting and civil liberties began to harden. General John W. Sprague wrote of the mood he observed in Little Rock, Arkansas, quote, "Those who had returned from the rebel armies were the most quiet and orderly. It is not so now," end quote. Increasingly, Southern whites were observed treating freedmen with, quote, "cruelty and callousness." To many, it appeared the Union was at the risk of, quote, "losing the war during the peace." All right. So Robert E. Lee, here's a statue in Richmond, Virginia, the Confederacy's most permanent capital, finally was removed. It's in recent days. So we have, the governor, ordering the removal of this statue back in 2020. It was held up in the courts, but ultimately the decision was made that yes, it will come down, and so it has. Right? This, accomplishes, a lot of work for the nation. But I want to end on a hopeful note. A look at a solution that from the start, identified itself as temporary. The solution we're looking at here. Our stay here on Earth is just that. It's temporary, and so too are these monuments, memories, and these turf battles. This is British artist Mark Quinn's "The Surge of Power." Jen Reid, Jen-R-E-I-D, and Jen Reid is the protester Jen Reid, whose image was captured when she stood on top of a plinth and raised her fist in the air, which temporarily replaces the statue in Bristol, England, a monument to the 17th century slaver Edward Colston. In June 2020, the Black Lives Matter activists knocked it off its plinth and hoisted it into the harbor. Michelle Lanier, North Carolina's first Black director of historic sites and properties, recently said, one of the greatest acts of racial violence is the erasure of people through silence. There's a Black saying, when you know how to swim, you do not have to drown. So when you have the tools you need and can conduct research on your own, you can find out for yourself what actually happened. So let us begin here. There's much to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mullen, for that very informative presentation. And there's a lot to think about. I would like to now tell the audience to please write your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so that we can start hopefully a discussion about what has been presented today. There is someone that has, Malik Wilson. I'm going to read it. It's rather long. He says, brilliant, extremely thoughtful and learned walk through the complexities of remembrance, esteem, and yes, the vagaries of terrible ideas once they are enshrined. A few questions closer to home for me that hopefully punch towards the deeper ontological meanings of what you are saying. As a young, hopefully 43-year-old Black man, my friends and I grew up drinking hip hop whole cloth. We still enjoy its grand beauty and depth and usefulness as an art form and inspiration, but it also bears its own lost cause, notions soaked in its bones, a stylish subsidiary position for women, a kind of clashing gay bashing that celebrates our presumed masculinity, and a kind of tribal violence that can still bubble up in the heart in inappropriate times. I'm convinced these are strands in the DNA that touch everything. They are inseparable. My question is with the building of the B.G. Smalls Memorial in Brooklyn a few years ago. We're nearing our time where our own statuaries is going up. Don't we all got lost causes? And though people might not say we're not in a position of power, This would certainly be a dispute according to our neighbors, loves, families, and friends. What are the more personal and broader implications of what you are suggesting? How do we live with these personal applications in an honest, historically gracious, and courageous way?
Thank you very much for that question, Malik. One of the goals of the work that I'm working on now is the enactment of a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And there is tremendous amount of work that our communities writ large have to do. But I think that one of the difficulties, I mean, you reference hip hop, and I love hip hop. My older son was a hip hop MC, and but hip hop is not a monolith. There certainly are lost boys. I mean, there's a range of messages and messengers in hip hop as there are everything else, and it's really important, I think, for individuals to as my son said to me when I was complaining initially that I couldn't understand, what these musicians were saying. They were talking so fast and using vocabulary that wasn't familiar to me. And he said, "Mother, when you are looking at a historic text, you pull out all of your reference materials and you do a close reading of the text. Why would you assume that hip hop is facile? Why would you imagine that you could just look at it very quickly, very cursorily, and understand its deeper meanings? You need to look at this text as you look at other texts and look at the layers." So I first want to say, that all hip hop is not the same, and I don't want to tar, the artists who are forward thinking, who are, who are not misogynistic, who are not bigoted, who are not solely focused on what I can get for myself, but who are looking for what we, the community, need. But I think reparations is the piece that's missing here. This is the reparations is the debt that the United States has owed now for 156 years to the Black people who emerged from slavery. This is a consequence of a promise that was made to the newly freed men and women of homesteads. And the denial of those 40-acre, the promise and then denial of those homesteads is what has put in motion this inability to acquire wealth. You're talking about, this whole arena that Malik is speaking of is one of deprivation, things that the Black community has not had as a consequence of government actions, not just in 1865, but coming forward. We know that in 1862, the federal government actively did give 160-acre land grants to white Americans. Some 1.5 million white families received those land grants. And this is land that had been, just very recently occupied by Native Americans. This completed the country's settler colonialism project. Those 1.5 million land patents translate into 45 million individuals today, white Americans, including recent European immigrants, who are still benefiting from that single government free equity program. This is why some 25% of all white Americans have wealth valued at least $1 million, as compared to only 4% of Black Americans. So, you have to look at the whole picture. What would the pandemic world have been like in the United States if Black Americans had already received reparations? We estimate the debt to be around $11 to $12 trillion. That comes to approximately $250,000 per family. If Black Americans had wealth, if they had the ability to protect themselves, to live in higher amenity neighborhoods, to send their children to high quality schools, to have access to medical care, to have access to legal counsel when they needed it. These are the kinds of things that one has if one has full citizenship rights. And, we have to kind of think about all of these spaces and places that Black people could be in if they were fully invested in by the federal government.
Thank you so much. So the next question is from Louis Venters, who says, thank you, Ms. Mullen. In addition to the national level conversation happening now around these monuments, might you speak some to the kinds of local community discourses and processes that are taking place / need to take place about how we use public spaces to commemorate the past? And with a follow-up comment of also they'd love to talk to you sometime about the work that the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission has been doing to reclaim some of the historical turf there.
Excellent question, Louis. In our own city of Durham, North Carolina, there are groups that are actively identifying sites of white supremacy, whether they be statues, photographs of the founding fathers in public places, public libraries, city halls, and they're calling attention to those spaces. Our city has created a racial equity task force, and this is one of the components of that task force. To redefine the spaces where we all live. So many of these places are, there's so much, so far in the recesses of our minds, we don't even see them in some instances. Some of you may be aware that Duke University removed a statue of Robert E. Lee from its chapel. And many of us, myself included, said, what? Robert E. Lee was in the chapel? Why was he in the chapel? I mean, I've been in that chapel dozens of times, and there must be, a dozen saints and others, but it had never occurred to me to stop and look at each one and see who they were. So part of it is making us more aware of what's on the ground. But there are a number of organizations. The National NAACP has, and I'm speaking now of the chapter in Chapel Hill and Carville, North Carolina, has a group of young folks who are looking at lynching sites. They have been connecting with the project of Brian Stevenson in Alabama, the Equal Justice Initiative, where they try to approximate the place where lynchings of Black people took place, and they're gathering soil from those sites that they then send to the Alabama site, and they're to put on display. But mostly it's a question of, opening our eyes to what's right there in front of us. The work of the group that Brett Leggs is leading, that I mentioned earlier, through the National Trust, is absolutely one of those that has local groups that are working. Full name here, this organization. Some states like North Carolina have really difficult language in the legislation that makes it hard, almost impossible, to remove these monuments and memorials. And what has to happen is that the legislature itself in those states has to change those laws. So I don't want to leave out the fact that being involved in politics, voting, making sure that you understand the positions of your city and state leaders is really, really important, and letting them know that these things matter to you. But that is also, I think, really important. I'd be very interested to hear more about the South Carolina group. It's such a complicated state in so many ways in terms of its Black heritage.
Thank you. Next question is from Jacob Watcher. I noticed a loose connection between the contemporary reaction of radical politicians to letting the Confederates run free and propagate their message, and the reactions from some politicians today regarding the January 6th Capitol storming. Certainly, it seems like some people are willing to idolize the people who stormed the Capitol in the same way that many people idolize the Confederate soldiers. Do you think this contemporary story may evolve in the same way as the Confederate narrative did throughout the 19th and 20th centuries? If yes, what do you think should be done regarding it? If not, how do you think this narrative may evolve?
I actually think it's a continuation of what happened, in the South in the 19th century. We've never had a moment when the message of the Confederacy was not the message of our nation. And what has happened more recently is the symbols that were much more private, much more privately revered, have become very public. And there's been a much more eagerness, a greater willingness to baldly say, white supremacy is what we're about. I think that, anytime any, white people stand by and let these proclamations go unremarked, you're part of the problem. We need to speak up and say, this is not, who we are. This is not who I want to be. And this is what I'm doing to alter that. We don't like to talk about money, and we don't want to like to talk about wealth and position, but that's a big part of what distinguishes these groups. The newly emancipated people were hoping to have a new start. They were looking for a seed, a grub stake. They were looking for something that was going to enable them to have a livelihood in this new world. And the Confederates and their sympathizers' attitude was actually, no, we prefer to have you be subservient. It serves us to have a subservient class, and we want you to be that class. And I think they're all, so all of that's going to redounds to us today. So I would say to Jacob that, the battle is the same. We still need a lustration process. We still need to call out these individuals, call out these actions for what they are, and say, no, this is not what we want going forward. I think, to actively advocate for a program of reparations, to say, I'm not doing that. And instead, I'm going to support a program. I'm going to petition and lobby Congress. I'm going to talk to my local, but also my state and my national leaders, send them letters, send them emails, and let them know what I think should be happening. But yes, I think there's a through line, from the point that the nation was founded with slavery as a basic tenet. We could have been founded as a nation that outlawed slavery. Many, many, many countries in the Western Hemisphere made that decision. We did not. Some people would argue that that's the reason why we separated from England in the first place, so that we could preserve the institution of slavery.
Thank you. So the next question is from Rotha Nash. Thank you for your insightful presentation, Ms. Mullen. It seems to me that you describe the process of erecting Confederate memorials as a kind of deliberate decontextualization of history. Do you have examples of Confederate memorials that have been more fully contextualized in a way that recognizes and honors the Black struggle for freedom?
So make sure I understand the question. So are there ways that the removal of some of these, so it's interesting. I mean, there people, so people kind of line up on several different platforms. There are people who say, leave the monuments where they are, but just give us more text, have side-by-side plaques. But if you have a monument that's 27 feet high, and then you have a plaque that's down low, how is that solving the problem? First of all, many, many people won't see the plaques because the monument is is visible as you're driving by every day. Their physical presence is so ominous and so striking that I don't see how any kind of explication on the ground, no matter how erudite, no matter how specific, is going to somehow neutralize the effects of these objects that are, marking the sky. Now, then there are others who say put them in cemeteries. since these are monuments to the dead, then they should all be transferred to cemeteries. Now, someone say, well, could they just be transferred to cemeteries for the Confederate dead, so that other people who are come to honor their ancestors would not also have to see these monuments? Then there's some who say, well, put them in museums. One of the things I've been wanting to do is to talk to colleagues at museums and find out how eager are they to receive all these monuments, and where are they putting them? In some instances, they're going to have to lay them on their sides, because otherwise they can't even get them in the building. And do they want to become the site of pilgrimage for these, Confederate advocates? So in Germany, the decision has been made to get rid of them. There are a few spaces where the story is talked about in its entirety, but there is, they worked really hard to eliminate the places and spaces where Nazi sympathizers could go and could congregate and celebrate. So I think I would lean toward the need to remove them entirely. If there are individuals who want to put them on their land, but you always have the difficulty of their being visible from large, from great distances. It's an ongoing issue. The last slide that I showed of Jen Reed is it's going to be replaced by many iterations, different ideas that artists have. And that, I think, is an interesting way to think about it, that these are not static decisions. These are moments in time, and we all should be contemplating what the next monument should look like, but never embracing again this notion of permanence.
Thank you very much. Kate, did you have a question?
Actually, yes, and I think it somewhat follows on from the last one. Obviously, there are a large number of university campus buildings that hold Confederate names. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about renaming those buildings, how they should be renamed. And I think that kind of ties on to the previous question.
I could give the example of Duke University and UNC Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Chapel Hill, as two that are exploring, kind of slightly, intersecting pathways. After a groundswell of concern was raised by not just the faculty and students, but also by their board of trustees, the president, in Duke's case, created a commission, to study the situation. And so it was consistent of all of those individuals, alumni, trustees, faculty, students, current students. And, they began to, first of all, unpackage who these individuals were on campus. As oftentimes, individuals had a much more mixed kind of history. Someone who was a stalwart educator, or who had been a philanthropist, who was there, able to provide financial support at a critical time, but who had also been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, for example. And so the decision ultimately was made that these individuals represented an ideal that the university espoused in that moment. But because they don't represent who we are now, this would also be the case of Vanderbilt University, that actually paid to have, I believe it was the UDC, take back the part of the building that had the name of the enslaver who they had donated. So I think the UDC had provided, I'm going to say something like maybe $150,000 80 years ago for this building to be constructed. And then the university had to pay them the equivalent of what the building would have been, what it would have cost them to construct that building today. And I want to say it was maybe several $1 million, but the university raised that money through its donors and alumni to pay the UDC to take the name off. And so these groups, these advisory groups, have come up with some very creative solutions. Some of them have looked at the names of some of the enslaved people who either were owned by the universities or who were who were known to have been actively involved either in the construction of those buildings. Sometimes the first Black tenured professor was selected to be that individual, especially if this was an individual who was known to have been very student-centric. In a couple of cases, they have picked, individuals just in the zeitgeist, Zora Neale Hurston or Frederick Douglass, who may not have had a direct connection to the university, but whose histories are well known and celebrated. So I haven't seen any singular path. In the case with the Duke, for example, the chapel where they removed the statue of Robert E. Lee, my understanding is that for the near term, they don't intend to put anything there. And the idea is that they hope that visitors will ask, well, what was here? And what are the circumstances around its removal? And that there will be more learning that transpires as a consequence of leaving that omission. Yeah.
Thank you for that very helpful answer. I just wanted to read that Jacob Watcher has written that he says, I have to go, but I wanted to thank Ms. Mullen for answering my question and for providing a wonderful presentation. Have a great day. If I may pose a question, Ms. Mullen, you have done so much work in this area, and your book on reparation with Dr. Doherty. What would you recommend as a way forward? And what I mean by this question is there is so much educating to be done in this country. I think there's been a lot of forgetting and a lot of need for reminding and educating ourselves about this, about monuments, about memories, about slavery in America. And I just wish to hear what your view is moving forward. What should we be doing?
I think we absolutely do need new curricula, and it needs to be taught for a minimum of 3 generations. A fuller, comprehensive curricula. Certainly when William Darity and I were doing the research for From Here to Equality, we were stunned over and over again by the discoveries that we made just looking at primary documents. It's not that the material is hidden, it simply wasn't selected in our to appear in our textbooks. I went to 3 different high schools in Texas, and one of them in Mount Pleasant, Texas, had a Daughters of the American Revolution chapter, if you can imagine, for students. And our textbooks were ones that the UDC had recommended. I want to say, a textbook about this thick, there might have been 4 pages on Black people. And, they were standing in a cotton field, which did happen, but, there's so much more to the story. But I think, efforts to use more primary sources, to bring the voices of, the Black abolitionists. I mean, Black people were the first abolitionists in this country. I would have been hard pressed to have named a Black abolitionist apart from Frederick Douglass when I was a student. That's tragic. Black people were trying from the moment that they appeared on these lands, to become free and to be compensated for their labors. So, I would say, looking at the actual documents, I mean, even looking at newspaper accounts, to compare the kinds of stories that a pro-Republican and a pro-Democrat, publisher, if you have the two of them side by side, as opposed to just showing one or the other, that will give students a richer idea of what was happening on the ground. I mean, the context is a thing that for me was missing as a student. I came along in the bad old days when history was dates and figures, dates and names. I can remember exams where we had to, in detail, describe 20 Civil War battles and name the officers down to the third rank and what the outcome was. But no one talked about what that meant to me. And so as a result, you spend a lot of time just memorizing things. I mean, I have an older sister, and I can remember helping her prepare for her exams, and we would come up with these songs. And I mean, many of us remember like the mnemonic to help you learn the names of the planets. My very educated mother just served us 9 pickles, and each of those words, my for Mercury, Mars, etc. But we had things like, 1862, the Homestead Act, Morrill Act, Department of Agriculture. Well, I had no concept that at the same time, white Americans, including recent European immigrants, were receiving 160-acre land grants at the same time that Black Americans were promised and denied even 40-acre land grants. I would have sat up and paid attention if someone had told me that in 6th grade. And I probably would have become a historian. So the information is there. We simply need to be prepared to talk about it, to do that research and to kind of line it up, as I think, was it Lewis who was talking about, how these things fit in our actual lives. The history is not irrelevant. Yes, it happened a long time ago, but we are living that history. And I think because we have not taught it well, we are reliving it, through events like those of January 6th. And I hope there won't be repeats of that, but there may be. Certainly during the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century, there were a number of successful coups. The January 6th coup was not successful, but there have been successful coups in this country before.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And I think that is all of our questions today, but I wanted to, again, thank you so much for this wonderful, important, and knowledgeable presentation. It gives us a lot to think about and to reflect on. And I want to just remind our audience today that not to forget about the book that you and Professor Doherty have written on From Here to Equality, Reparations from Black Americans for Black Americans in the 21st Century. That is published by the University of North Carolina Press. And Kate, what is this last? Is it a
so
question?
there is one last question if we have another couple of minutes. Is that?
Are you okay with that?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Yes, so this is from Richard Hughes. Can a case be made for the future monuments being archaeological sites, the humble archaeological remains of ordinary people and their lives? The excavated remains not put in museums, not made into reconstructions that are effectively one-off interpretations. One sees here the archaeological remains being left in situ, stabilized and not rebuilt, available for change of meaning and value as society changes. These would be more interesting future monuments. Regards from London, UK.
That's a fascinating thought. There are so many of these sites. I'm wondering about the capacity and the will of their proprietors to do that work. Certainly there is a tremendous amount of need for it. I remember for years, school children across North Carolina would go to Winston-Salem, to the old Salem town. And when they were doing some repairs, and I believe the church is called St. Philip's, because of its age, the Historic American Building Survey team was brought in to take a look before the repairs began. And one of the things that they discovered in their excavations was that the church was built on top of a Black cemetery. And it was interesting too, because the community had been thought to be one that was not a community of enslavers. In fact, that was kind of the rhetoric, that they were anti-slavers, but all this was, brought to light. So there is much that can be learned. I don't know. I'm not up to date on the kind of resources the federal government has at this point to finance that kind of research. But I think it could be very, very exciting and very revealing. But again, I would just wonder, what kind of resources we have to make a meaningful a project happen in the US.
All right, thank you so much again, really from all of us, for your presentation, and we look forward to reading your book, and hope to see you sometime in the future with another interesting project that maybe you will be engaged in. But we really appreciate your being with us today. Thank you.
Many thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
And thank you. Sorry. Yes.
No, just saying, take good care.
Thank you. And I'd like to just remind our viewers that tomorrow we are hosting another very important event, and you can see the slide right now: Critical Race Theory, Public Debates and Teaching in the Classroom. This session will be moderated by Dr. Rashawn Ray at the University of Maryland, and will feature Dr. Crystal Fleming and Dr. Victor Ray. So we encourage you to please sign up, register. It'll be at 2 p.m. tomorrow. And thank you so much for joining us today. Bye-bye.